What makes a unit good in Fire Emblem? Well, to quote Excelblum, it's good if they can kill everything and not die. And if there's any Fire Emblem unit you can expect to do those things, it's Ryoma. I don't think anyone will dispute that Ryoma is one of the best units in Birthright. It's well known that you can just undeploy everyone besides him and Korin and let him coast through the rest of the game. This is often what some casual players do instead of actually engaging with maps once they start getting dangerous. And once they're done with the game, they often proceed to call Birthright boring. But of course, there are more ways to use him that don't just turn the game into a complete slog of endlessly mashing end turn. Joining me today is probably the world's biggest Ryoma fan, Mayor of Smashville, the creator of what I think is the best Fire Emblem ROM hack that I've ever played, Birthright Rebirth. This hack completely overhauls Birthright's campaign to make it play like Conquest Lunatic. It ensures that all the characters are viable and fun to use, and creates incentives that really reward fast and aggressive play. Birthright Rebirth is what led me to get as good as I am at Fates, and I really hope you guys will check it out. A link to the Discord will be in the description. But you're not here to listen to me plug a ROM hack. You're here to learn more about what you can do with Ryoma, so let's get started. Ryoma is widely considered to be the easiest unit to use in the game of Birthright. He joins pretty late in the game, at chapter 13. I believe he's the latest non-corn sexual to join. But he is probably the most powerful at base. So yeah, what do you think about Ryoma?
I think he's alright. No, I think he's easily in contender for top 5 units, just outright, and definitely puts in a good word for being top 3. I think there are a couple early game units that beat him just because of their availability, but Ryoma's bases are just insane, especially if you're doing a 0% runs.
60 defense boosted by Bushido, which will pretty much always be active, which gives him an effective 18 defense, 15 resistance, on top of his pretty high for Birthright, 36 HP at base, with decent growths in those as well.
I think a lot of people in this community believe Ryoma to be more of a spongy unit, but if you actually look at his stats, 16 defense, he has one of, if not the highest base defenses out of any character except the Corn Sexuals in Birthright. And if you combine that with Bushido, I mean, he already at base has larger defense than Leo with Bushido active. And nobody's going to call Leo a spongy unit.
And of course, the thing that sets Ryoma apart from everyone else in the game is, of course, the Raijinto. It has unrestricted 1-2 range as a sword. It has 11 mites, which is significantly higher than most of the tomes and daggers you'll be using. And it also has 80 hit, which is not bad, and 10 avoid, which pretty significantly helps his survivability once you start stacking his avoid.
Raijinto really sets Ryoma apart. If Ryoma didn't have Raijinto, he'd still be a good unit, but we wouldn't be talking about him as top 5, maybe. He definitely wouldn't be in the top 3. Ninjas would pretty much outclass him. Raijinto is basically what seals Ryoma's kit altogether. Unrestricted 1-2 range, high avoid, his pretty middling bulk altogether make him just the best unit to solo with in the game outside of just Korin.
And Birthright is a funny case because, well, pretty much every character in the game can solo Birthright. But Ryoma is the one that requires the least efforts to do it with. With a lot of characters, you need to choose specific Korin to get soul or any particular bulk or attack boosting skills. But with Ryoma, you can just stay in his base class, give him a Korin pair up, and pretty much just turn your brain off, not do anything special with him, and he will just win the game from his join time.
Exactly. I think Ryoma does sometimes struggle, especially with inexperienced players against late game generals. Anything with big lance that have high defense and high strength can puncture a hole through, especially since they ignore a lot of Ryoma's avoid since they do have lances. But most of the time, enemy layout in Birthright will allow you to avoid these, and Ryoma's pair-up options, especially someone like Rinka, who even not promoted at all can give him +6 defense with just Bushido if she's S-ranked with him, can just make him survive 2 or 3 attacks, especially with his high 36 HP with his HP pool.
And a lot of late game Birthright maps allow you to control the amount of enemies you take on per turn pretty well if you just choose how you approach them correctly. And Ryoma, once he has sustained with buying concoctions or has healing supports, you can pretty easily make sure that he doesn't die. And even in situations where he has a chance of death, his avoid and his skills, including Vantage and Astra and his high crit rate with Bushido and the Raijinto, can make him cheat death a lot more often than most of your other characters.
Yes, Ryoma's middling bulk is really something that I think a lot of people harp on too much when he has other avenues to explore. Like you mentioned, Astra. Astra allows him to get up his guard gauge up very quickly. So even with stuff like generals that can hit him for like 15, 10 damage, they hit him, he can oftentimes guard gauge past them, especially if he has Vantage active. He can oftentimes kill a general before in one hit with a crit.
Especially when he's stacking bulk with the +4 strength of the Raijinto just for existing in his inventory, +2 from Bushido, plus I believe it's 6 from S rank Rinka, and of course the 11 might that the Raijinto has. He can do pretty significant damage to generals, although on 0% growths, actually, he does struggle a lot more against them. I know during some of the later game maps, 0% growth Ryoma without support will do 0 damage. But once you take into account things like meals, tonics, pair up, Bushido, those can get him far above what he needs to kill with a crit.
Yeah, it's very easy to get to 1-round KO range with Ryoma, especially in the late game if you're not doing 0%. But it does take some level ups to happen. So there can be some games where you don't get 1-round KOing Ryoma against generals. But oftentimes, those generals aren't really too much of a factor, especially in the late game. A lot of those maps can be easily skipped. Hans's map has a very easy turn 1 skip.
Birthright notably also has buyable rescue rods, so you have what you need.
Most of Birthright, especially during the late game, when a lot of the maps become kill boss, you get access to so many different options to turn 1 skip. It doesn't feel as bad, Ryoma's footlock status, because a lot of the turn 1 skips just require him to just be paired up with somebody, and then he can easily 1-round KO. Like Hans. Hans, he is very quick to 1-round KO, even near 0%. He just needs specific boosts, and obviously the pair up that he'd get from his flyer to immediately just take Hans at the door immediately.
Even if you're struggling to reach the thresholds immediately, if you just do paralogs, Ryoma is probably the easiest character to level up in the game. You could just send him into a crowd, and more often than not, they'll be dead and he'll be alive by the end of the turn. And he will have gained a lot of experience from paralog experience scaling.
That's a lot of Ryoma gameplay right there. Since Ryoma's avoid is so high, especially against units with bows and axes, and a lot of paralog units do use both bows and axes, a lot of times they can either have 0% avoid or just they can't damage him at all, depending on who your pair up is. So Ryoma actually has a very easy chance to just not get hit like for entire paralogs, because a lot of axe enemies are grouped together.
It's very funny that 0% growth Ryoma can just barely take any damage from like the promoted adventurers that you see in things like Firefalls. They do like 4 damage to 0% growth Ryoma before Bushido or pair up is active. His stats are just good.
They're amazing stats that I think someone like Xander spoils a lot of the community, especially since we talk more about conquest when we talk about actual unit viability. It's a very easy comparison to compare Ryoma to Xander. Ryoma just does not have the defense pool and the HP pool that Xander has, and can get very easily due to his stats and his skills. But he's by no means a frail, weak unit like some people try to make him out to be. He still can take a lot of damage before he goes down, even with 0%.
And if you do the calculations, you'll notice that he does have a chance of death a shockingly high amount of time, especially if you take into account his crits messing with your guard gauge. But his actual chance of death will, in reality, be very low if you position him correctly. One of the things that I find as Ryoma's biggest problem is that he's very greedy when it comes to experience. So a lot of the units that I like to use, which include Oboro and Hayato, you can kind of tune their damage output to make sure that they don't one-round your enemies so that they can leave a lot of experience for your other training projects, which are the big reason why you're playing Birthright. It's not to just plow through the game, it's to raise a lot of the weird units that you want to try building in a unique way. And if you just put Ryoma into a group of enemies, instead of being able to feed your experience to your other meme units, they're just going to be dead at the end of the turn, which is not always ideal in the context of Birthrights.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of reasons why when people do even just non-challenge runs of Birthrights, they just play normally. But their one caveat usually is they don't use Ryoma because they want to build every other set of units. So you'll see a lot of people just do play through a Birthright, but I won't use Ryoma. Especially nowadays, after even the people who still play Birthright like I do, sometimes I won't use Ryoma. I still think you can use him in fun ways without completely just plunking him down, but it would be hard to say that I don't understand. It's not like I don't understand why people bench him so they can level up their other units, because if you're playing Birthright, like you said, you're trying to get everybody else leveled up. You want to have a more balanced team, and in Birthright, a lot of enemy stats are just so low that you can really bring anyone up. Even really bad units like Setsuna or Hayato, you can bring them up, in which they can be in like the upper echelons of your team. Same reason why some people train up Mozu, even though she's just an awful unit. A lot of people love building up the people who are low all the way to the top, and just having someone handed to you that can one round KO half the enemies in the game at base, and then the other half he just needs a meal and a tonic. I can see why people don't use Ryoma in that sense.
So yeah, what do you think about Ryoma's base class sets? He has access to Samurai and Sky Knight at base.
Alright, so anything that does not have Ryoma using Raijinto is immediately out. Sky Knight is useful for its flying capabilities, and yes, even with a Bronze Lance, Ryoma does have some ability to one round KO some lesser enemies, but 1-2 unrestricted is just too good to pass up, and whether it be Kinshi Knight or Sky Knight and its promotion, it's just not worth it to get rid of Raijinto. So I would just always keep him in Swordmaster if you are just going off of his Heart Seal and just his regular class set.
Yeah, you're probably not going to be needing Camaraderie as healing or Rally Speed, because Ryoma is not going to be your support units. Warding Blow in theory might be useful in very, very edge cases, but generally you can just put Ryoma into mages and they'll be dead and he'll be alive. Air Superiority helps a lot less in Birthright just because a lot of the flying units that you'll encounter are going to be Wyvern Lords and Malignites, which are green and red on the weapon triangle, which Ryoma is strong and neutral against. And Amaterasu, again, Ryoma is probably not going to be your support unit, and if you have units close to Ryoma on the front lines, then you're probably doing something a little bit off.
Yeah, and it just his Samurai skills that he gets synergizes so well with the rest of his kit. Duelist Blow, obviously, for when you're doing those kills that you require one round KO, you got doubled and you don't want to take that hit. Oftentimes you can get 0%. Vantage easily extends his bulk. A lot of enemies he can one round KO or one hit KO, especially if he's kitted up with someone like Rinka or a strength boost of some sort.
Or he procs Astra, of course.
Yep, gets his guard gauge up, which allows him to not get hit, and also basically one round KO anything, because almost nothing in the game is going to survive one Astra from Ryoma, especially if he crits, which the biggest problem with Astra is if it crits, because if it crits, it can also mess up your guard gauge. So what could be a free guard gauge could end up just being just one short, in which you could get hit by a general next phase if you're not in Vantage mode already.
Astra is notably half your skill as its proc rate, and his skill isn't the best. It is solidly usable, but it's not something that you should be relying on if you're doing your calculations. 9% at base before pair up and tonics isn't ideal, and it's not going to get too much higher than that even with growths, but sometimes it does let him not die, which is another thing that stacks the deck in Ryoma's favor.
That's Seal Attack, correct? From Master of Arms?
Yes.
Usually when you have Ryoma, you are going to one round KO everything you throw against him.
And even if you don't, then Vantage will probably let him kill on the third hit.
Yeah, so seal attack isn't really useful. The big thing right here that you get from Master of Arms is life and death. You're taking Ryoma's middling bulk, admittedly, and you're cutting that by a pretty significant margin to get. And sometimes you can get into one-hit KO range, but when you get into that later game, what you're really worried about is the general, and getting less defense against the generals is not really a good sign, because you want to stay in that vantage range, and if you're not able to one-round KO them, or heaven forbid, you aren't able to kill them on the next vantage, they're going to kill you.
And of course, Swordfare's general +5 damage with the Raijinto is never a bad thing. Sometimes it's worth putting him back into Swordmaster just to get Swordfare at level 15.
Yeah, I would definitely say Ryoma, by the end of the game, with all skills, Ryoma has an easy chance to kill almost anything he wants. It's surviving it that's Ryoma's biggest problem in the late game.
So what are your thoughts on Ryoma's friendship class sets? He gets Cavalier from Silas, he gets Archer from Takumi, and he gets Ninja from Saizo.
Cavalier, I think we all know, is one of Ryoma's, if not his best, class option. But just skill-wise, Elbow Room obviously gets him further into that one-round KO range that Ryoma most likely is going to hit anyways. But with the combination of other skills or tonics or whatever, he can easily hit one-hit KO range, especially in the mid-game. That's Shelter, right?
Yes.
The second one, yes, Shelter. Ryoma is most likely not going to be using Shelter Azor strats, especially not in Birthright.
Although if you're memeing around with using Takumi as Ryoma's pair-up, Takumi can sometimes occasionally use the Fujin Yumi, and Ryoma can shelter him, which can be funny sometimes, but it's really not good.
Next is Defender, that's +1 in all stats, correct?
If he's paired up, yes. It's one of the better bulk boosting skills in Birthrights just because the other ones don't really exist. It's not something to really complain about, and it helps him reach the defense thresholds to minimize his chance of death, which is always nice.
And proc skills, I usually don't mess around with a lot of proc skills. Birthright is very much enemy phase, so having Armored Blow on him doesn't really help him much.
Although, if he is fighting generals, it can help, but often he can just attack them from the range at which they can't counter.
Exactly. Armored Blow, I really want to waste the slot, especially since there's a lot of better skills on here that you probably rather would have on Ryoma. And I don't know too much about these two skills, so if you could...
I believe that's Aegis and Luna. It halves the damage dealt by enemy attacks using bows, tomes, daggers, dragon stones, breath, and ballista.
Yeah, bows is not going to hit Ryoma at all. Tomes has a good chance, but a lot of the times you can one-round KO, or especially one-hit KO, especially mid-game tome users. And the damage they hit for Ryoma, most of the time, it's enough that he can survive off of. Shurikens, the only Shurikens in Birthright, if I recall correctly, Firefalls are maids, and maids don't usually have the attack and speed required enough to pose really any threat to Ryoma. And breaths,
for the final boss, technically it helps, but generally not really.
You only fight one enemy in the game that uses breaths by that point that you get Ryoma, and by then you have to bank on you actually hitting with maybe a 20 or 30% chance getting half your damage. It's just not worth it.
Is there anything that stands out from the Archer class line?
Quick Draw is just something Ryoma doesn't need.
For one-rounding generals, Quick Draw might sometimes be useful.
It could be, but at that point, if I'm really wanting to kill one general, I just equip good armor. Yes, it's from
Chapter 7.
Yeah, Armor Slayer, obviously, with if I really needed to kill one, but it's not worth delving into Archer and basically gimping Ryoma for a couple with E-bows just to use certain blow. Because you'd have to keep him an archer for 3 levels. Bow fair, Ryoma's never going to be using bows, and that's air superiority, right?
Yes, air superiority and Amaterasu.
Neither of those skills, I think, are useful enough to want to waste turns in not only archer, or sniper, or Kinshi Knight.
Now, the ninja class line is funny. Not because it's particularly good, but for what it can enable. Because we see that Mechanists can give Ryoma replicates, and having 2 Ryomas on the board can be funny, although it's not always ideal just because he's not invincible like some of your other units like Hayato or Rajat or Saizo. So being on two places in the map and being able to be hit by two different sets of enemies is not always ideal for Ryoma in particular, but it can be funny and it has a high ceiling technically.
This is true, but most of the time when you get to that point where you can get access to replicate, you'll be level 15. And I've seen runs where you can get Ryoma to level 15 around chapter 24. By then, there's a lot of one-turn skips before you get to the end game, and replicate's just not as useful as it could have been for clearing out some of the easier maps. And then you have a lot of maps in that end game phase which have a lot of generals, which can hit Ryoma for a ton of damage, especially you don't want to put Ryoma in that position where he's getting attacked by like 15 enemies in one enemy phase.
Replicate is notoriously not very useful in an LTC context just because it effectively wastes your turn 1 action that could have been spent, say, killing the boss in Birthright's kill boss late game maps. So, usually not the best option in late game Birthrights if you're doing skip strats.
Yeah, and then his others, Lock Touch. A lot of the doors and chests that you need can easily be picked up by some of the other better units, which would be Saizo and Kaze, which are definitely in the top 5 best units in and of themselves.
Really? You think Kaze is better than Ryoma?
Kaze shows up a lot earlier than Ryoma does. Do I think he's much better than Ryoma if we take into account when he joins, will he have the stats that Ryoma inherently has? No. But by the time you get Kaze, he's had like 9 chapters, I believe, of use.
Yeah.
He's still going to have a lot of use up until around the 20s, where Kaze slowly starts to fall off. If he doesn't have a lot of help. And even if he gets a lot of help, like through tonics and meals and boosters, he's still going to be pretty useful.
Sure. Although that would require you to take Rinka off of Ryoma and put him onto Kaze.
Exactly. And a lot of players aren't going to put in the work to actually save Kaze.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of players are going to because they want to have everyone saved. But if you don't want to save Kaze, well, there's not many more maps he's going to be really useful for after chapter 15. Poison Strike. Not many units are going to survive Ryoma, and that chip damage isn't going to help them survive 3 hits
and
from
it's
Ryoma.
player phase only, by the way. So
yeah, player phase only. And lethality rarely hits. I don't think it's that useful, all things considered. And Shuriken just
why are you using Shurikens as Ryoma?
Yeah, because he's gonna start off with E rank, and even if you do like forges and get him up to D, and you get iron forges, it's just not gonna be that good when he has Raijinto right there. And even with Master Ninja, you can use Raijinto, and you're going to be using mostly Raijinto.
Gollum is technically useful because there are a few Stoneborn that exist in Birthrights, but you generally don't need Gollum on Ryoma. Although, the Ninja class line is useful for Ryoma solo runs because it gives him the only answer to the hardest boss in the game, which is the door to Xander's room.
Well, that's true. That's true. For Ryoma solo run, getting to a lot of those enemies up there in chapter 25 can pack a ton of damage into Ryoma. So being able to just open the door to Xander and just kill him in like 10 seconds, pretty much useful.
There's also a door on the top side of Xander's room too, so you need it lock touch either way.
Don't the doors open if you kill both Laszlo and Perry?
Oh really? Okay. I didn't know that.
Don't quote me on that though, because I think I can speak for everyone saying that we all just opened the door and killed Xander right away.
Yeah. So now that we've got the friendship classets out of the way, what do you think of Ryoma's marriage options?
The 2 big marriage options, especially if you're not going for A rank Silas just to get Paladin and just keeping him there, is going to be either Rinka or Kagero. And Korin, I don't think it's a waste of Korin to try to get them married together, even though it can benefit Ryoma arguably the most. You're wasting Korin for far too long to really excuse the amount of effort that's going to be to get them married and together.
It is the easiest way to complete the game, but when you're playing with full deployments, then Korin's utility is best used somewhere else.
Mozu and Setsuna really don't give Ryoma anything. They make Archer is just not a good class for Ryoma. Ryoma doesn't really get anything out of their skills that he could dip into, mostly because he gets the same skill through a Heart Seal anyways. Same thing with Azura. Felicia's not really giving him any of the pair-up stuff that he needs, so really I think it's just going to be either Kagero or Rinka, really.
So why do you think Kagero is a good wife for Ryoma?
+1 movement.
Oh, yeah.
And sticking to Ryoma for the rest of the game. I think if you want to waste either Saizo or Kagero to get Ryoma into Ninja, I think Kagero is the better option than wasting time with Saizo getting to A+. But you can do the same with A+ Saizo with Ryoma to get Ninja, and then do Oni Savage Rinka anyways to get best of both worlds. Because I really do think the star thing, if Ryoma's going to dip into anything that's not Cavalier, it's going to be Oni Savage. For one particular skill that you get out of the end of Blacksmith.
Oh yeah. Lancebreaker is probably the best skill that Ryoma can get from any marriage class, just because it helps patch up his one weakness, which is the generals and great knights that have lances.
Yeah, and Ryoma just, with Lancebreaker, which you only get near the end of the game, which is fine, because the generals only start to become an actual issue near the end of the game. Blacksmith is not a bad class Ryoma can go into. He loses a lot of his avoid, but he gains a little bit of bulk.
And he does still have access to swords.
Blacksmith is not a bad class to put in Ryoma for a little bit near the end. So say, I believe it's the strat is go from level 12, go into Blacksmith, you get the the other skills, and you get that final skill at level 15.
You want to go in at level 11.
Level 11, thank you. With Rinka herself, she also allows Ryoma with Bushido to get +6 attack and +6 defense, which number one gets him closer to 1-round KO range and allows him to patch up his bulk. So he's able to withstand a lot more punishment with that extra bit of defense he gets. Almost to the point where I'd say it might be useful if you have Rinka connected to Ryoma to put on Life and Death.
Maybe. You'd have to really be planning your runs through the late game chapters if you want to give him Life and Death, which I know a lot of Birthright players just aren't going to do. But it is something that you can do, yeah. Yeah, I do think that Rinka Marriage is probably his best option outside of Korin, which is the best pair-up for everyone. Oni Savage, as a class line, is in a bit high demand just because all of your magical units will want to go into Oni Chieftain. If you want to complete the game in as easy a way as possible, then just slapping Rinka onto Ryoma and making him as close to unkillable as you're gonna get is probably your best bet, yeah.
And I think the big elephant, the big green-haired elephant in the room here is if you get rid of Rinka from Kaze, Kaze basically just lost a lot of his firepower that made him 1-round KO and survive hits before.
But in general, in late game Birthrights, you only really need like 3, maybe 4 carries if you're going to go down all the paths. So having Kaze disappear isn't such a big deal if you have already Izana, Saizo, and Yukimura as your other carries.
I think the one thing Kagero might have over Rinka is the fact that you get a fast support out of it. So you're able to more quickly gain those support points, get to S rank. But when you get to S rank, Ryoma is most likely not going into Master Ninja, and since a lot of those skills he's not really going to want or need.
I should also note that you do not want to get Quixotic on Ryoma. Ryoma is probably the worst unit to get Quixotic on just because it tanks his avoid so bad. He does appreciate the hit a bit, but the avoids penalty that Quixotic gives is just so bad for Ryoma's survivability. It's the one unit that you really should not be getting that skill on, besides maybe like Saizo. But yeah, let's see how Ryoma stacks up against one of your other late game carry candidates, which is Saizo. Now, on this slide, I have compared a level 4 Swordmaster Ryoma, which is his base, with a level 4 Master Ninja Saizo. And Ryoma doesn't look that much better, especially when you take into account his lower hits and slightly lower defenses. But the one thing that I've left out of the slide is that By the time you get Ryoma, Saizo will not be a level 4 Master Ninja, he'll probably be a level 15 unpromoted ninja.
Yeah, so I think trying to scale Saizo up like this is kind of somewhat unrealistic because, like
Yeah.
as you said, he is not going to be level. Especially you're not going to promote him at level 20, and even if he did get to level 20, this is just his average stats and what he's going to get to. So he might get nowhere near these. He might get close to them. Then again, he's gonna have a Brass Shuriken +3 against Raijinto, and Ryoma at that point with no investment is close enough that staking a lot of EXP and a lot of investment into Saizo at that point to get him to snowball that much and that fast, I still wouldn't say that even with these average stats, he would measure up.
The big lead that Ryoma has over Saizo in attack is just so big. Usually it's going to be overkill, so it doesn't really matter, but that is just such a big number. I'm still in disbelief that they just give it to you at chapter 14.
That's the big thing that gets Ryoma set apart, is that his attack is he just punctures holes in almost every unit. Where ninjas, they get carried by the fact that their shurikens can be forged so much, and Birthright gives you gold like candy, so you're able to just stack and stack and stack, and you can get really high shuriken forges pretty quickly.
So I'm interested in hearing your take on the Birthright tier list. You said that Ryoma is probably top 5 in the game. So who do you think are the units that are better than Ryoma?
I think Korin, easily best unit in the game.
Yeah.
Best unit to solo with. Not many things that are effective against him. You're not going to fight many enemies with Worm Slayers or anything like that. Korin has easy access to flying, and he can one-round KO while doing it, whereas Ryoma doesn't really have much viable options for 1-2 flying, if any options at all, outside of like Bolt, Naginata, and a lot of prayer and hope.
Yeah. His 5% magic growth.
Yeah, that's not going to cover. A lot of Noor enemies do have low resistance, but it's not going to be that low. So there's a Malik Korin, especially just quick promoted. I mean, you're talking from chapter 1 all the way to chapter 14, and it's just going to blow Ryoma right out of the water. Azura, very easily, she's a token singer. She's able to facilitate a lot of the skips in Birthright, especially in the mid game and late game. That's another character who I think is just outright better than Ryoma. Ninjas, all because of their availability. I think by the time you get to Ryoma's map, the ninjas start to be losing a little bit of effectiveness. They can still hit one-round KO benchmarks, but Ryoma is really going to take center stage. But it is worth to note that a lot of skips that you can do, those ninjas can also hit the benchmarks against, say, Flora. I did a playthrough where I saw somebody use Kaze, and he was able to just get Kaze just enough that he was able to run around Hans. Saizo and Kaze, I think they have that extra ability that they can sort of emulate a lot of what Ryoma does, but in just a strict capability of plunk somebody down in the middle of a group of enemies and who's going to slay them all and have the least likely chance to die. Ryoma is going to be that guy. But I think because of his availability, he won't be as over-centralizing as some people think he is. Or at least not in the sense that your entire game is just going to be defined by Ryoma. Maybe after you get him, but before him is a pretty large stretch of time. Before him, yeah.
Now, what do you think is the class path that you usually put Ryoma through if you want to use him as one of your carries?
If I'm using him as a carry, I'll probably want to make the game a little bit more interesting and do Oni Savage Rika as his marriage option. Get him to a level 11, and then get him to have Lance Breaker to really just completely decimate the ending of the game and not have anything stand in my way.
Not using Silas?
Now Silas is fun, but I find that a lot of skips or a lot of quick kills in Birthright, you don't really need the extra move unless you're flying. Flying, I think, is one of the more important things you need for if you're doing really fun quick kills, and Ryoma could just be backpacked onto somebody who can fly and just taken right there. The extra move doesn't help a lot in my experience, because the difference between like chapter 14, like I even did a a run just to see what a Paladin Ryoma would even do with such a large open map, and the difference is like 2 or 3 turns, and it's just not that big of a difference that I would just rather have Ryoma with Rinka and do the Lancebreaker strat near the end of the game. But that's not to say that for most players, Ryoma is probably best with Silas.
Okay. Anything else that you want to add about Ryoma?
When people look at Ryoma, I think they think of him as the absence of fun. And that's why a lot of players nowadays don't want to play with him, because they feel like using him sort of invalidates a lot of other units, which can be the case. But I would like to say that there are fun things you can do with Ryoma. You know, different class sets you can go into, like again, Lancebreaker, make him more overpowered, or just have him section off sides of the map and keep your other units consolidated, like say chapter 25, if you want to play it straight. You just want to pick Ryoma and a couple other units right, and then have another units go left. That's a perfect way to use Ryoma without having too long of player phase. And that's about it. I do think he is definitely top 5. It's just the only gnawing thing at him is his availability, and that a lot of units can reach his milestones and his benchmarks in the mid game, which really leaves the late game for Ryoma to truly shine. And by then, a lot of the maps can be filled with one-turn skips and stuff that can diminish the true use that you could get out of Ryoma and say he was in like Conquest.
Now, is there anything you want to plug at the end of this video?
Anything I want to plug? Fire Emblem Fates Birthright Rebirth is my own hack that I've done. I'm only up to chapter 21 at the moment, I believe. I'm still looking forward to having more playtesters. Is it at all possible if I could plug a link to the Discord in my in your description?
Yeah, of course.
So please check it out. I would love to hear anyone's thoughts. It fills me with a lot of joy to see people playing this hack. Ryoma, I did admittedly nerf a lot in order to not invalidate a lot of the other buffs that I gave to other units. I would love to play. Thanks for having me on, Balk. I really, really appreciate it.